You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith.
Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Friday, December 14th, 2018. It is also the feast day of St. John of the Cross. Now, before we get into Moses once again today, let's talk a little bit about our saint of the day, St. John of the Cross. St. John of the Cross was a Carmelite, and he worked very hard, along with St. Teresa of Avila, to reform the Carmelite order in a time when it was desperately in need of reform. St. John of the Cross also wrote some many beautiful spiritual works that encourage us today to dive even further into prayer and to explore the mystery of God. So this week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we have been talking about Moses. Moses was an Israelite. Even though the Israelites were enslaved at the time, he was raised as an Egyptian prince. Eventually, he was exiled, worked as a shepherd, encountered God on the top of Mount Sinai in a burning bush, and returned to Egypt to do God's work of leading the Israelite nation to freedom. After many plagues in Egypt, including the last plague, where God sent his angel of death to kill the firstborn in each family, and he passed over the doors of the Israelites who were marked with the blood of a lamb, after that plague, Pharaoh finally gave in, and he granted freedom to the Israelite nation. So the Israelites packed up their things, and this is a huge nation. If you can imagine thousands upon thousands of people traveling together, they left Egypt. But the big question was, where do they go now? Because they were slaves. They didn't have land to go to or a lot of money to help them buy land. They left Egypt completely trusting on the providence of God. So they traveled, and not long after they left Egypt, Pharaoh changed his mind. He decided that he really was a god and that he would go and get his slaves back. So Pharaoh assembled his army in their chariots, and they chased after the Israelite people. They caught up to them at the shores of the Red Sea. But God did not abandon them. God put a pillar of fire between the nation of Israel and Pharaoh's army. He protected them, but where would they go? They were trapped with the sea on one side of them and Pharaoh's army on the other side. Well, it might seem like an impossible situation, but as we know, nothing is impossible with God. God blew across the waters of the Red Sea. He parted the sea. He blew it so it was as if a wall of water was on your left and a wall of water was on your right, and in the middle, dry land. So with the pillar of fire holding off the army of Pharaoh, the Israelite nation walked through the Red Sea. Isn't that incredible? God protected them. He led them to freedom. And once they were all safely through the Red Sea, God took down the pillar of fire, allowed Pharaoh to chase them into the sea, only to allow the waters to crash down upon them. God protected his chosen people while vanquishing their enemies. Now, from there, it was not completely smooth sailing for the nation of Israel. They still had many years to still learn the ways of God. From the Red Sea, Moses led them to the summit, to Mount Sinai, where he had met God. He went, he spoke with God, and God gave him 10 commandments. The 10 commandments that we still have today. The first 3 talk about our relationship with God, how we shouldn't worship other idols, how we should keep his name holy, and keep Sunday holy. The other 7 commandments talk about how we should treat each other, how we shouldn't lie or steal or want what other people have, and how we should truly love each other. After receiving these 10 commandments, Moses went down the mountain And what did he find? He found his nation worshiping an idol. The idol they were worshiping was a calf they had made out of gold. So they had just been rescued from Egypt, and it took them hardly any time at all to turn their back on the God that had saved them. Of course, the people responsible for the idol were punished, but God had mercy, forgave them, and continued to work with the Israelite people. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, where they witnessed many miracles of healing and being fed. But at the end of it, they crossed over into the promised land that God had designed for them. The only problem, there were already people living there. So although they were brought to the land for them, they had to fight to get it. But at this point, after 40 years of wandering in the desert, they finally believed that God would help them. So the first battle, led by Joshua, was against the city of Jericho. And through God's miraculous work, through hardly any fighting on their own, the walls of Jericho fell, the Israelites had victory, and they entered their promised land. Now, there is much more to this story than I could cover in this short podcast. It is a rich and beautiful, fun, meaningful story. Moses played some great roles, and he was a great prophet in the Old Testament. So, Sprouts, here is my challenge for you today. This week, we were talking about Moses, and the greatest thing that Moses did was nothing he did on his own. His greatest accomplishment is that he was faithful and he obeyed God. It is simply that. So I want you to think about the character of Moses. I want you to think, how closely am I following God? And say this simple prayer: Lord, guide me.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. One final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.